Everything you are about to see in this video has been researched and verified to the fullest extent as possible for me to do. If you spot an error, please get in contact with me so I can make a correction. My intent is not and has never been to mislead anyone with my work. That being said, I hope you enjoy the culmination of a year's worth of research and digging, which has led me to this moment where I get to share this with you. Enjoy.
Imagine, Rachel, that you had one of the Democratic nominees for 2020 on your show. And that person said, the only other adversary of ours who's anywhere near as good as the Russians is China. Why should Russia have all the fun? And since Russia is clearly backing Republicans, why don't we ask China to back us? China, if you're listening, I'm sure our media would richly reward you.
You don't have a choice.
From the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, said to have begun sometime in December of 2019, the battle to control the narrative has been fought ferociously by global organizations, CEOs, billionaires, and the programs at the center of the Wuhan Institute of Virology controversy.
Humanity's most dangerous enemies have always been invisible and unpredictable.
Smallpox, 20th century.
500 million deaths.
Spanish flu, 1918,
50 million deaths.
SARS, 2003, economic cost, $54 billion US.
H1N1, 2009, $5 billion cost to Mexican tourism alone.
Ebola, 2015, 11,310 deaths.
Zika, 2016, $3.5 billion cost to global economy until now.
Fear,
Panic.
free fall.
Where will the next epidemic originate?
What price will we pay?
Epidemics are impossible to predict.
The next epidemic will come.
But nobody knows when.
And nobody knows where.
Despite the billions of dollars poured into global health programs, national health programs, and foundations, it seems that most of the efforts undergone to prepare and plan for the next epidemic have been largely useless. One of the main figures at the center of the COVID-19 origin story is Peter Daszak, president of EcoHealth Alliance, who has a long history of working with both the Wuhan Virology Lab and Dr. Fauci's NIAID. Despite his attempts to shift the blame to anyone else but himself and his team, all roads eventually lead back to Daszak. There is no direct evidence for COVID-19 coming from a lab as of yet, so I'm sorry to disappoint you. but there is a lot of supporting evidence. However, there's no direct evidence that it didn't come from a lab either, so that's important to keep in mind. More than that, the people telling you there is no evidence are the very same people that are either standing in the way of an official public investigation, or, in Peter Daszak's case, are in charge of the ongoing private one. Let's get into it. Buckle up!
We're here in a fairly small poultry market near Guilin in China, and what we're doing here...
The EcoHealth Alliance is a non-profit organization, 5013C, which protects the people, animals, and the environment from emerging infectious diseases. The nonprofit is focused on research that aims to prevent pandemics and promote conservation in hotspot regions worldwide. Or so they say. There was a lot of controversy last year when it was discovered that the EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Virology Lab worked together. People said that the Wuhan Virology Lab gets money directly from the NIAID. However, that is not the case. What is the case is the EcoHealth Alliance receives millions of dollars in funding every year from the NIAID and then turns around and gives it directly to the Wuhan Virology Lab. Don't believe me? Let me show you. Since 2002, the EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak have received over 32 grants worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from the National Institute of Health. Most of them come from the NIAID. However, some of them come from the Fogarty International Center. Those are older. Over the years, Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance have received $5,764,128 from the Fogarty International Center and $7,875,012 from the NIAID for a grand total of $13,639,140. When President Trump pulled the funding for the EcoHealth Alliance last year, it seemed like a huge deal. However, that was before I learned that the EcoHealth Alliance also has contracts with other departments in the government amounting to millions and millions more dollars. For example, this contract with the Department of Defense for $4.5 million, this other contract for another $2.9 million, this contract with the National Science Foundation for $499,000, this contract with the Department of Homeland Security for $566,000, this contract for $1.2 million with the Department of Commerce. Oh yeah, and all these. Yep. Every last one of them belongs to the EcoHealth Alliance. So Peter Daszak is doing very well. If you go to usaspending.gov, you'll see that the EcoHealth Alliance has been awarded $61.5 million over 117 awards. You might think the top awarding agency would be the Department of Health and Human Services, but you would be wrong. The top awarding agency is the Department of Defense, and they've given the EcoHealth Alliance $41.91 million over the years. Also worth noting, in the fiscal year of 2020, the EcoHealth Alliance received $24,815,260. Most of that was not from the NIAID. Looking at the finances for the EcoHealth Alliance, over 91% of their funding comes from government grants. That also includes subcontracts, which aren't as easy to track down. His connections also extend very far outside of the EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Virology Lab. He works for the Center of Infection and Immunity at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. One of his colleagues that he speaks to regularly is Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is the brainchild behind the Millennium Development Project, is a frequent peer to George Soros, and the former advisor to the United Nations Director General Ban Ki-moon, and Kofi Annan.
One of the largest and most visible programs designed to achieve the Millennium Development Goals is the Earth Institute's Millennium Villages.
This is a broad net partnership to find effective ways to harness the talents and technologies of each of the sectors towards achieving the Millennium Development Goals.
Millennium Villages are largely the brainchild of Jeffrey Sachs, a leading economist on development issues and the director of the Earth Institute. At a press conference at UN headquarters on Monday, he spoke alongside George Soros.
The main achievement was to make African leaders understand that the Millennium Villages approach is working.
Over $72 million in new funds have been pledged to support this shift, which is designed to promote self-sufficiency and the eventual achievement of the MDGs. When asked about the turbulent state of the global economy, Mr. Sachs and Mr. Soros both expressed concern about shrinking development aid budgets, but also certainty that the Millennium Villages were durable enough to sustain these cuts and remain fully functional.
Around the same time, Jeffrey Sachs said that China's performance in the UN summit is extraordinary, And he also said that China's investment in Africa was not neocolonialism, but was investments and donations. The claims made about the Millennium Villages project would turn out to be way too good to be true in most cases. In fact, Jeffrey Sachs would have to post several retractions published in The Lancet. If you're interested, you can find more here at this report, which discusses how some of the claims made were just completely unfounded, and that the overall project was unsustainable past the completion of the project. Jeffrey Sachs has also written pro-China articles such as this one on the war on Huawei, and another one where he defends Huawei, where he says the US, not China, is a threat to the international rule of law. And is on the record as saying things like, the world needs China's leadership. He's also frequently quoted by Chinese state media. He was also run off Twitter when it was discovered he had deep connections to Huawei. So it's concerning to find out that Jeffrey Sachs was made chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, and also that he named Peter Daszak as one of the commissioners. When the COVID-19 outbreak first began, a statement appeared in The Lancet in support of the scientists, public health officials, and medical professionals of China combating COVID-19. A Freedom of Information Act request would later prove that Peter Daszak organized this out of his own self-interests, and most of the people signed on to the letter have close affiliations with Daszak, who in turn has very close connections with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In an email sent with the subject line, a statement in support of the scientists, public health, and medical professionals of China, Daszak encouraged his colleagues and cohorts to sign on an agreement that they stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting the 2019 novel coronavirus does not have a natural origin. It's important to remember that at this point, the World Health Organization had barely declared COVID-19 an emergency, and at this point, absolutely zero investigation had taken place. Daszak would later tell the Wall Street Journal that the Lancet letter was written during a time in which Chinese scientists were receiving death threats, and the letter was intended as showing support of them as they were caught between important work trying to stop an outbreak and the crush of online harassment. So it was completely done to protect China. Peter Daszak's constant involvement with people like Jeffrey Sachs and the World Economic Forum suggests that he could be another one of those type of men who are so disconnected with reality that they will do anything to shape the world, not realizing what they're doing. Look no further than a press release on Peter Daszak's own EcoHealth Alliance website made on October 26, 2018 as evidence. In the press release, they announced the EcoHealth Alliance receives consultative status to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. The EcoHealth Alliance's Executive Vice President for Health and Policy states, EcoHealth Alliance's approach to development, global health, and capacity strengthening is critical for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals set forth by the UN in 2015. An online seminar sponsored by the School of International Public Affairs, the Earth Institute, and the Mailman School of Public Health is co-hosted by Scott Barrett, Jeffrey Sachs, and Jonas Ben-Amor. Peter Daszak appeared on the program to talk about the origins of COVID-19. But more on that in a minute. Peter Daszak first got involved with the Wildlife Trust, which was later renamed as the EcoHealth Alliance in 2010. In 2011, the EcoHealth Alliance referenced Jeffrey Sachs several times. They also tweeted a question, is Western-style democracy, a la USA, compatible with sustainability, or is Eastern-style, a la China, better? This question was posed at the 17th Annual International Sustainable Development Research Conference, hosted by the Earth Institute. The Earth Institute is possibly Peter Daszak's most concerning association, as the Earth Institute has posed many questions over the years that seem to leave out the sovereignty of nations in exchange for unrealistic and unattainable goals. One of the biggest difficulties in doing this project was tracking down the actual trail behind these people. In fact, a lot of these sites have been completely removed from the internet, so unless you know where to look and unless you know how to find them, you're not going to see them at all. Nonetheless, find them I did, and among the list of partners for the EcoHealth Alliance, you will see the Earth Institute Center for Environmental Sustainability listed. On Peter Daszak's profile on the Columbia Institute for Infection and Immunity's website, it lists a lot of his associations. Obviously, he is the director of the EcoHealth Alliance. He previously served as executive director of the Consortium for Conservation Medicine, but it also lists 3 positions that he's held at 3 American universities and then 2 British universities as well. He has also served on committees of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the World Health Organization, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Department of the Interior. Listen to his introduction by Scott Barrett in that seminar I spoke to you about, where Jeffrey Sachs was present. Barrett details Daszak's involvement in many programs, including ones with the White House and the World Health Organization.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is Scott Barrett. I'm a professor in SEPA and the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and I'm joined by our co-host, Jeffrey Sachs, and today we're pleased to welcome Peter Daszak Peter Daszak is president of EcoHealth Alliance, launching the Global Virome Project. He's a member of the National Academy of Medicine and chair of the Academy's Forum on Microbial Threats, and has advised the director of the Medical Preparedness Policy in the White House National Security Staff and the World Health Organization on pathogen prioritization for R&D.
To summarize this section before we move on, Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance receives far more in funding from the United States government, including grants from the Department of Defense, among others. He is also closely associated with Jeffrey Sachs via Columbia, who frequently appears alongside George Soros in talks and seminars. Daszak is very well connected to many globalist enterprises and their organizers. His own organization touts the Sustainable Development Goal model originally devised by Jeffrey Sachs. So when Peter Daszak deflects and says his team and their research that directly involves the Wuhan Virology Lab has nothing to do with the SARS coronavirus outbreak in 2019, it follows a pattern that the organizations he surrounds himself with do, wherein they blame a lack of funding or other outside factors. It is never his fault. Peter Daszak repeatedly insists that the emergence of diseases has to do with climate change and ecological drivers. However, he seems to turn a blind eye repeatedly to the fact that he and his organization are funding and directly involved with the gain-of-function research done in labs that changes the nature of known viruses. Gain-of-function research involves experimentation that aims or is expected to increase the transmissibility and/or virulence of pathogens. The research can pose risks regarding biosecurity and biosafety. Gain-of-function research is a subset of dual-use research that can be used for both beneficial and malevolent purposes. Such studies include the genetic engineering of a superstrain of the mousepox virus in 2001, the artificial synthesis of a live poliovirus from chemical components in 2002, and the reconstruction of the 1918 Spanish flu virus in 2005. Around the same time that Peter Daszak and the Wuhan Virology Lab started cooking up different strains of SARS to see if they could get it to pass into humans, gain-of-function research usage was being debated by high-profile scientists from around the globe. Among the people joining the discussion was Anthony Fauci, director of the NIAID, the head of the COVID-19 task force that works routinely with Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance. On December 30th, 2011, he published an opinion piece for the Washington Post titled A Flu Virus Risk Worth Taking. In it, he discusses a flu virus found in birds, H5N1, that had recently come under a lot of fire because the scientists found that it was easily transmissible in ferrets, which are a very close model for humans. The virus had been created using gain-of-function research, and the results were so concerning, some said that the results shouldn't be published at all, or if they were, they should be redacted. Eventually, though, the results were published in full.
I can't think of a moment bigger than this one. I've likened this as the moment for biology akin to the moment when fissile nuclear material was figured out by physics and offered both a way to solve the problems of the universe and nuclear weapons.
These papers really represent a seminal moment in life sciences. We now really have been confronted with examples of where the science itself, which is very important in moving forward for the public's health, also pose a potential risk for nefarious actions or even those situations where this virus might escape from a laboratory. So we're really at a point for the first time of trying to balance the need to know versus the need to protect. We believe that it would be not in the world's best interest to have all the detailed information come out. One of the really disappointing parts of this discussion to date has been that everyone seems to have their own set of facts. I've watched a number of the life scientists who have made blanket statements about the public health utility of this kind of information or what we can do with it as an argument for why it should be widely disseminated. And in the first instance, none of this holds water. There's been a lot of misunderstandings about what the real utility of this information is in protecting the public's health.
Another article written on the subject was written by Lynn C. Klotz on August 7, 2012, titled The Unacceptable Risks of a Man-Made Pandemic. They make the case for dealing with 3 other potential pandemic pathogens, which are smallpox, the 1918 flu pandemic virus, and SARS. They say that SARS is being studied in laboratories around the world using less than the highest biocontainment facilities known. They say that there are 30 labs working with live SARS virus and at least 10 using the 1918 flu virus. They map out a mathematical model that says that the probability for escape from a single lab in a single year to be 0.3%, which they say is a conservative estimate. From that probability, it would take 536 years for there to be an 80% chance of at least one escape from a single lab. With 42 labs carrying out potential pandemic pathogen research, the basic 0.3% probability translates to an 80% likelihood of an escape from at least one of the 42 labs every 12.8 years. They cite the fact that SARS has already escaped laboratories 3 times since 2003, and that there are 30 labs working with live SARS viruses worldwide. They say that moving SARS to BSL-4 labs alone would not be enough to reduce the risk. There have already been 3 escapes from BSL-4 laboratories since 1990, including a Marburg virus laboratory-acquired infection, a foot-and-mouth disease virus escape from the Pirbright facility in England, and a SARS virus laboratory-acquired infection from a BSL-4 laboratory in Taiwan. But that actually isn't the only outbreak of SARS that's come from a lab. The first was in Singapore in August of 2003, in a virology graduate student at the National University of Singapore. He had not worked directly with SARS, but it was present in the laboratory where he worked. In an article for The Lancet titled Recent Singapore SARS Case, a Laboratory Accident, they conclude that inappropriate laboratory standards and cross-contamination of West Nile virus samples with SARS coronavirus in the laboratory led to the infection of the doctoral student. The second escape was in Taiwan in December 2003 when a SARS research scientist fell ill on a return flight after attending a medical meeting in Singapore. Investigation revealed that the scientist had handled leaking biohazard waste without gloves, a mask, or a gown. Another person was a 20-year-old researcher in Beijing and a 26-year-old laboratory researcher in Anhui province. The researcher was nursed by her mother, who also caught SARS, and she died. And finally, a 31-year-old male laboratory researcher who worked at the Beijing Virology Institute. Over and over again, you'll hear World Health Organization officials and Peter Daszak insist that because there are so many safety guidelines in place in labs, it's very unlikely that COVID-19 could have originated from one. However, that is demonstrably proven false, and there are far more instances than just the ones listed previously involving other viruses. It is hardly reassuring that despite policy demands for rigorous biosecurity procedures, potentially high-consequence breaches occur nearly daily. In 2010, 244 unintended releases of bioweapon candidate select agents were reported. Being practical, the question is not if such escapes will result in a major civilian outbreak, but what the pathogen will be and how well it can be contained, if it can be contained at all. Between 2004 and 2010, the CDC received 727 reports of theft, loss, or release of select agents and toxins. There are 11 total laboratory-acquired infections associated with BSAT releases. There were 16 TLR reports submitted to the CDC in 2004. In 2010, there were 269. Not only that, these sort of reporting methods and styles require that the participating labs be honest and open about the mistakes that are occurring in their workspaces. Listen to this coverage of the first outbreak of SARS in 2003 and tell me if you think China would be honest about anything going wrong in one of their virology labs.
This week saw the galloping rise of SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. And as new cases emerge, quarantines expand, and the disease spreads to North America, the consequences are multiplying.
How is the U.S., how is the CDC equipped in handling it compared to China, which was accused of being sort of mishandling it at the beginning?
And this first started in southern China, in Guangdong province, in November. And the first that anyone from China even mentioned this was not until late February. And even then, all throughout Beijing, it was an enormous cover-up. They were literally taking SARS patients, loading them in buses, and driving them to hotels immediately before the investigators from the World Health Organization would show up so that they would walk into a hospital and not see these cases.
So keep in mind the history of China literally busing people out of hospitals during the SARS outbreak in 2003 to hide outbreak numbers from World Health Organization officials sent there to investigate when you hear Peter Daszak, who is part of the current WHO team tasked with investigating the origins of COVID-19, when he says that everything surrounding the lab seems okay. Simultaneously, keep in mind the ongoing controversy surrounding gain-of-function research in the early 2010s and the multiple instances where SARS escaped from labs in the mid-2000s. Also consider the reports centered around lab accidents in which the number of reports is growing exponentially year over year, and the article which said the mathematical possibility of a lab outbreak is not a matter of if, but a matter of when. There have been a few times where they've expressed some self-awareness, as in this tweet in 2015 where they say engineered bat viruses stir debate over risky research. In this article, they discuss the debate going on about engineering viruses to become more lethal or more contagious, known as gain-of-function research. Peter Daszak is quoted as saying the study findings move this virus from a candidate emerging pathogen to a clear and present danger. Well, he would know best. Let's have a look at the history of Peter Daszak and the laboratories involved with the research involving SARS. His first funding from the National Institute of Health centered around the Nipah virus and the risk of future outbreaks of viruses in South Asia. That research began in 2002. And it is actually that first award in 2002 to study the Nipah virus that brings Peter Daszak and Shizheng Li together for the first time. Despite the research centering around Nipah virus, it seemingly brought them together after studying bat reservoirs of viruses, including SARS. The first paper that Peter Daszak and Shijing Li authored together is titled Bats Are a Natural Reservoir of SARS-like Coronaviruses. It was submitted on August 5, 2005 and accepted and published on October 4, 2005. At the end, it states this work was jointly funded by a special grant for the Animal Reservoir of SARS Coronavirus State Key Program for Basic Research Grant, which comes from the People's Republic of China, and the NIH NSF Ecology of Infectious Disease Award from the John Fogerty International Center, which are some of those very first awards that I mentioned towards the beginning of this video. The second paper they authored together is from December 2006 and appears on the CDC's website. In the abstract it says, recently we and another group independently identified several horseshoe bat species as the reservoir hosts for a large number of viruses that have close genetic relationship with the coronavirus associated with severe acute respiratory syndrome, known as SARS. Our current research focused on the identification of the reservoir species. In addition to the SARS-like coronaviruses, many other novel bat coronaviruses have been detected by PCR. The discovery of bat SARS-like coronaviruses and the great genetic diversity of coronaviruses in bats have shed new light on the origin and transmission of SARS coronaviruses. The end of the paper states, although at this stage we cannot rule out the possibility of direct transmission from the natural reservoir host to humans, molecular epidemiologic studies and studies of the receptor S protein interaction indicate that the progenitor viruses are unlikely to be able to infect humans and that a rapid viral evolution in an intermediate host seems to be necessary to adapt the virus for human infection. They also say that they believe that a continued search in different bat populations in the People's Republic of China and neighboring countries, combined with experimental infection of different bat species with SARS coronavirus, will eventually identify the native reservoir species. So this right here is where they admit that they're going to be experimenting on the viruses to see how they can cross over into humans. In the end, in the acknowledgement, it states the work conducted by our multi-nation collaborative team was jointly funded by a special grant for animal reservoirs of SARS coronavirus, part of which was a special fund from the president of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is where Shijing Li works, and the National Institute of Health National Science Foundation Ecology of Infectious Disease, which is the award that comes from the NIH at the John Fogerty International Center. I know that's a lot to take in, but bear with me here. This means that Peter Daszak was involved with Shijing Li much sooner than originally thought, and it also explicitly states that they plan to engineer the virus to see if they can get it to cross over to different species as a method to see where the virus might emerge next. They have a very long and very established history of working together, and there is also a similar history of the United States funds going to these very studies that likely put us into the situation we are in now. In 2008, the study of bat coronaviruses turns over to Dr. Fauci and the NIAID in the award titled Risk of Viral Emergence from Bats. This award extended from 2008 to 2012 and was valued at around $2.5 million. In the award abstract, the description says they will use a range of in vitro techniques including infection and bat cell cultures to examine the pathogenesis of the new viruses and a pool of available bat viruses which have not yet emerged in humans. This award leads to the third paper of consequence that Peter Daszak and Shijing Li co-authored together. It was published on October 30th, 2013, titled Isolation and Characterization of a Bat SARS-like Coronavirus that Uses the ACE2 Receptor. In the abstract, it states, here we report whole genome sequences of 2 novel bat coronaviruses from the Chinese horseshoe bat family. These viruses are far more closely related to SARS coronavirus than any previously identified bat coronaviruses, particularly in the receptor binding domain of the spike protein. And finally, it states, our results provide the strongest evidence to date that Chinese horseshoe bats are natural reservoirs of SARS coronavirus, and that intermediate hosts may not be necessary for direct human infection by some bat SARS-like coronaviruses. And finally, like always, in the acknowledgments, they acknowledge financial support from China, the NIAID, and a few other programs. It also explicitly states that Shijing Li and Peter Daszak designed and coordinated the study. All authors contributed to the interpretations and conclusions presented. And lastly, Shijing Li wrote the manuscript with significant contributions from Peter Daszak. But the real kicker is the award that extended from 2014 to 2020, where the project summary states, in a previous R1 we found that bats in southern China harbor an extraordinary diversity of SARS coronaviruses, some of which can use human ACE2 to enter cells, infect humanized mouse models, causing SARS-like illness, and evade available therapies or vaccines. We found that people living close to bat habitats are the primary risk groups for spillover, that at one site, diverse SARS coronaviruses exist that contain every genetic element of the SARS coronavirus genome, and identified serological evidence of human exposure among people living nearby. They say they will use S protein sequence data, infectious clone technology, in vitro and in vivo infection experiments, and analysis of receptor binding to test the hypothesis that percentage divergence thresholds in S protein sequences. They say the data and analysis will be critical for the future development of public health interventions and enhanced surveillance to prevent the reemergence of SARS or the emergence of a novel SARS coronavirus. 2 years after the funding began, Peter Daszak and Shijing Li, known as the Batwoman in Wuhan, co-authored a paper titled Bat Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Like Coronavirus Encodes an Extra Accessory Protein Involved in Modulation of the Host Immune Response. At the end, they thank a group from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a person from the Chinese Academy of Science in China, and say the work was jointly funded by the National Science Foundation of China and the National Institute of Health, NIAID. For funding information, it says this work included efforts from Shijing Li and was funded by the National Natural Science Foundation of China. It also included efforts from Peter Daszak, who was funded by the Foundation for the National Institute of Health, the NIAID. Before we jump more into the research carried out by Peter Daszak in the Wuhan Virology Lab, let's take a look at the funds received directly by the EcoHealth Alliance and where those funds go. Since the EcoHealth Alliance is a nonprofit organization, it is required to file a Form 990-PF, which lays out its finances in great detail. For the 2015 fiscal year, we see that Peter Daszak drew a salary of $353,981, $30,000 of which is a bonus, and $46,000 of which are non-taxable benefits. We also see that the EcoHealth Alliance has granted $892,810 to the Columbia Mailman School, which is where Peter Daszak and Jeffrey Sachs work together. We also see 2 different items for China listed as program services, one for coronavirus and emerging diseases, and one just for coronavirus. The form specifically states that they only have one office in that region, so we have to assume this is the program that works with the Wuhan Virology Lab. These are itemized specifically as wire transfers, so in 2015, $300,000 got wired directly to China for coronavirus and emerging diseases. You also see where they detail the Department of Defense Global Rapid ID tool, which they developed to enhance the performance of a diagnostic tool to diagnose outbreaks of emerging infectious diseases. Whatever happened with that $2.3 million, we may never know. For the 2016 fiscal year, we see that Peter Daszak made $25,000 more than he did in the previous year, and there are also more wire transfers to China for coronavirus research. It's a lot of the same for the 2018 990-PF, but in 2019, we see a direct wire transfer from the EcoHealth Alliance to the Institute of Microbiology for the Chinese Academy of Sciences for $195,000. So there's the proof that the EcoHealth Alliance does directly give money to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is where Shijing Li works, which works in conjunction with the Wuhan Virology Lab. And just for the fun of it, to drive this home, this is the Wuhan Institute of Virology's website for the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which details all of the name changes and all of the associations of the institute. To summarize everything we have learned so far, Peter Daszak receives far more in funding from the United States government than originally known, and the Department of Defense is the biggest spender by far. Daszak is a close associate of Jeffrey Sachs via Columbia, who is a frequent cohort to George Soros. Sachs invented the SDG model for the United Nations, and Daszak espouses them with his EcoHealth Alliance objectives. He blames climate change and other factors for the emergence of infectious diseases, despite being directly involved with the gain-of-function research and experiments that create the viruses that are currently emerging. The research and experiments at the Wuhan Virology Lab were happening at the same time that gain-of-function research usage was under heavy criticism. They even wrote about it in 2015 as being a controversy. Despite Daszak and the World Health Organization insisting that lab safety is a priority and makes the emergence of a virus from one an unlikely event, there are plenty of instances where viruses have escaped from lab settings, including SARS. China bussed sick people out of hospitals during the SARS outbreak in 2003 to hide infections from the World Health Organization team sent there to investigate. Peter Daszak is part of the WHO team this time around and acts completely oblivious to that fact. Peter Daszak was involved with Shijing Li much sooner than originally thought, and they repeatedly state that they are engineering the viruses they discover and work with to see if they can make them more contagious. And lastly, Peter Daszak makes a very comfortable salary working at the EcoHealth Alliance. The EcoHealth Alliance has also directly wired money to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, clearly evident in the organization's 2019 Form 990-PF statements. Phew! So where do we go from here? Let's take a look at the last few papers co-authored by Peter Daszak and Shijing Li that are by far some of the most damning there are in the collection. Another piece of this very complicated puzzle is the paper published in November 13, 2017 titled Discovery of a Rich Gene Pool of Bat SARS-Related Coronaviruses Provides New Insights into the Origin of SARS Coronavirus. In this paper, they state that they found 11 new novel coronaviruses in bats, and they also found viruses that have a 99% similarity to the original coronavirus that broke out in 2003. They also mention using a chimeric virus to assess whether the 3 novel SARS coronaviruses can use ACE2 receptors as a cellular entry receptor, and all of this research has been going on for 5 years. On December 11, 2019, Chinese state media released a propaganda video titled Youth in the Wild, Invisible Defender about that very same cave. It's eerie. Check it out.
从事病毒样本采集和分类工作，使命。湖北地区有丰富的病毒媒介样本资源，在已知的生物中，蝙蝠体内病毒较为丰富，可以找到绝大多数的人类致病病毒，狂犬病毒、SARS、埃博拉病毒，就是蝙蝠栖息的洞穴成我们的主战场。蝙蝠的生活环境都在人迹罕至的洞穴里，但只有这样的环境，才能找到最理想的病毒媒介样本。
最安全了。这里的蝙蝠它主要是菊头蝠和蝠翼蝠。
如果说我们的皮肤裸露，很容易接触到蝙蝠的排泄污染的物体，所以说这个风险比较。因为你发现病毒的过程，也是最容易被病毒感染的过程。在过去的10多年里，我们走遍了湖北的每一个角落，探索了几十个没有开发的洞穴，研究病毒媒介300多种。但我却希望，这些病毒样本只是作为科研而留存，永远都不会有应用的一天。
Wasn't that something else? At the end, he even says he hopes the viruses they find are only used for scientific research. A few weeks after Dashik and Xi Jinli published their first paper, they published yet another paper, this one titled Serological Evidence of Bat SARS-Related Coronavirus Infections in Humans, China. In this study, they performed serological surveillance on people who lived in close proximity to caves where the bats that carry diverse SARS coronaviruses roost, which is that exact cave in Yunnan province. 2.7% of their high-risk group tested positive for SARS coronavirus antibodies, and they suggest that this study farther supports the notion that some bat SARS coronaviruses are able to directly infect human without intermediate hosts, as suggested by the receptor entry in animal infection studies. It is also absolutely worth mentioning that they use Wuhan as their control group for seropositivity, citing that Wuhan is more than 1,000 kilometers away from Jining and where inhabitants have a much lower likelihood of contact with bats due to its urban setting. So anytime you have Peter Daszak or anyone associated with telling you that the wet market could be the origin of COVID-19, ask yourself, if they say in this that there's a low likelihood of them encountering bats, why all of a sudden was there the narrative that there was bats in the wet market? It's been proven repeatedly that the pictures that were being shared initially were not even of the market in Wuhan at all. For more on this, I highly suggest you check out the article written by Yakov Appelbaum titled Today's Special, Contaminated Bat Soup and Stale CCP Disinformation Salad, where he examines the lies surrounding the COVID-19 origin story and proves them one by one absolutely to be false. In 2018, Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance were a lot more open about their findings on the emergence of SARS and the evidence that SARS-like coronaviruses seem to already be spilling over into humans. In 2018, the EcoHealth Alliance publicly tweeted that they had discovered a SARS-like virus spilling over into people in China. Daszak also tweeted about it and mentioned Xi Jinli by name. Daszak posted images of that cave in Yunnan province on his Twitter in 2018 in October, and he questioned, could this cave be the origin of the 2003 SARS outbreak? Later that month, he was actually in Wuhan at the 8th International Symposium on Emerging Viral Diseases. He mentions being there with the past, current, and future Directors General of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This was hosted in Wuhan, China. The announcement states, emerging viral diseases pose a great threat to global public health and become hotspots and key topic in life sciences and medical research. Peter Daszak is listed as one of the invited speakers. While at the conference, Peter Daszak also tweets about his 4.5 years of productive collaboration with Xi Jinli in Wuhan on the NIAID SARS coronavirus project. It says 5,370 bats were sampled and released, 2 papers in Nature, 1 in Cell, 15 others published, and more on the way. This was on the 21st of October 2018. Behind Daszak, you'll see his list of collaborators. It wasn't until 2020 that it would become public knowledge that during 2018, while Daszak was on his Wuhan publicity tour, United States officials visited the Wuhan virology lab several times and made some stunning discoveries about their lack of protocol and adherence to the rules for lab safety.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology was the world's premier lab researching bat coronaviruses and their possible transmission to humans, establishing that bat coronaviruses had the potential to be transmitted to humans, using several bat coronaviruses in experiments with other animals. Nearby at the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention Lab, they were also studying bat coronaviruses. Over the last 2 months, these previously forgotten diplomatic cables were widely circulated inside the Trump administration as officials debated whether or not the novel coronavirus that's plaguing the world could have originated from one of these 2 labs in Wuhan that were studying bat coronaviruses for many years. The cables seemed newly relevant in light of the fact that there was a lack of information coming out of these labs and that the Chinese government's original story that the virus emanated from the Wuhan seafood market seemed to be falling apart. Right now, we do not know the origin of the novel coronavirus. One big reason we don't know is because the Chinese government has instituted a severe clampdown on any information related to its origin. The seafood market in Wuhan has been sterilized. The lab has been silent. All public research is now restricted by the Chinese government. So while we can't say that the virus originated from the lab, we can't rule it out either.
On December 31st, 2019, Peter Daszak made a series of tweets speaking about his time in China. He shared information released from the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission and a report with images of the market where cases were first found. Daszak noted that the market is called a seafood market, but also sells butchered mammal meat. SARS has not been ruled out, and we've heard the Chinese labs are using a range of tools to test for SARS and SARS-related coronaviruses, as well as to rule out usual suspects of pneumonia. Putting this into context, there's concern about another SARS-like outbreak, but having worked with Chinese collaborators for over 15 years on SARS coronaviruses, the labs in China are far more efficient now than they were in 2003, and the clinics are numerous and better prepared. He says the China CDC and provincial CDCs are working effectively already, and there is an openness and transparency right now that wasn't there during the first SARS cases. Also, no sign of wider outbreak yet. Let's hope this is not a novel viral agent, and that it resolves rapidly. He gives background on the risk of reemergence of SARS coronavirus or a novel SARS-related coronavirus. He says that EcoHealth Alliance has been working since 2004 in China to trace back the origins of SARS coronavirus. He states, "We showed it likely originated in bats and that there's a large SARS coronavirus diversity in bats in China," and references the papers that I shared with you previously, detailing the caves in Yunnan province and the spillover in humans there. He also admits that they isolated SARS coronaviruses that bind to human cells in the lab, and others showed some of these have pandemic potential, able to infect humanized mice and not protected by candidate SARS vaccines or monoclonal therapeutics. He then states they worked with the Wuhan Institute of Virology with Xi Jinping to design seral tests and showed that people in rural China are already exposed to bat coronaviruses. He also states we've just been refunded by the NIAID to continue this work and assess whether exposure to these bat coronaviruses is related to illness in people. As part of this surveillance and through our leadership in China and other Southeast Asian countries in PREDICT, we also found a novel bat origin coronavirus causing the death of 25,000 piglets in 5 farms in South China, working with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. All this work shows that there are plenty of diverse coronaviruses related to SARS and less related circulating in bats and other mammals in Southeast Asia. He says there is a huge interface among wildlife, livestock, and people in the region that viruses are actively moving across, and that there's a high potential for some of these viruses to cause illness in people and livestock. He said the good news is that leading scientists from the US, China, and many other countries are working together to actively block the ability of these viruses to spill over and to rapidly detect them if they do. This includes active collaboration with the China CDC, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and an diverse array of provincial CDCs, universities, and labs across South and Central China. He says we're all hoping this outbreak is not SARS and is rapidly controlled, and this will be a wake-up call for proactive surveillance across wildlife-human-livestock interfaces and emerging infectious disease hotspots, guided by predictive modeling to fight against potential pandemics of disease X. And lastly, there is the beginnings of a global mechanism to do this, working with the NIAID, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, the Wellcome Trust, and the leading agencies in countries like China that are often on the front line of disease emergence, but these relationships need our support. This is the notice the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission put out on December 31st, 2019, about multiple cases of pneumonia originating from the Wuhan seafood market. Nowhere in the notice does it mention SARS or the potential for the outbreak to be SARS-related. From Daszak's initial string of tweets, it's clear that he is not willing to implicate the Wuhan Virology Lab in anything that's going on in China. Every time he references his work, it's spoken about with the suggestion that the work he and the Wuhan Virology Lab are doing is merely helpful and not at all posing a potential risk to the public.
What worries me the most is that we're going to miss the next emerging disease, that we're going to suddenly find a SARS virus that moves from one part of the planet to another, wiping out people as it moves along. And I think we need to get out there and look for these before they emerge.
Peter Daszak worked with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and they literally captured 10,000 bats. And they took blood samples from the 10,000 bats, and they found 50 coronaviruses that had been unknown. No one knew they were out there, and yet they had the capability of moving from the wild into human beings.
So give me an overview. You said you have labs throughout the world that you work with. They're not employees of yours, though? You contract them, or some of them are?
Usually we subcontract to labs, but we usually try and have, in every country, a country program officer who manages the work we do in a country.
This interview took place in December of 2019, right before the alleged start of the COVID-19 outbreak.
We often hire technicians in labs or PhD students, to have a presence in the lab. There's more of a buy-in when you've got a person there.
Okay. Do you have people in China working on this?
We've been working in China for years.
When you start connecting the dots, it becomes apparent just how interconnected their spheres of influence are, and how hard they often try to hide those connections.
Around SARS, we focused on SARS coronavirus emerged from a wildlife market and was the first pandemic of this century. So it's a big event. So we started to trace back from the wildlife market which species carried the virus that came into those markets. We found that it was bats, not civets was the original idea.
Right.
And we went out to southern China and did surveillance of bats across southern China. And we've now found over 100 new SARS-related coronaviruses, very close to SARS. Some of them get into human cells in the lab. Some of them can cause SARS disease in humanized mouse models and are treatable with therapeutic monoclonals, and you can't vaccinate against them with the vaccine.
You can't vaccinate against them. There are no antivirals. What do we do?
You can manipulate them in the lab pretty easily. It's just spike protein drives a lot of what happens with the coronavirus, zoonotic risk. So you can get the sequence, you can build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this. Insert it into a backbone of another virus and do some work in the lab. So you can get more predictive when you find a sequence. You've got this diversity. The logical progression for vaccines is if you're going to develop a vaccine for SARS, people are going to use pandemic SARS as
sure.
But let's try and insert some of these other related and get a better vaccine.
And I guess also knowledge of what's there. If you see something emerging, it give it a head start on making a vaccine or a therapeutic.
That's true. And that's one of the big things that we've been trying to push, anticipating, forecasting pandemics. It doesn't mean you can stop them. That's the problem.
So there you have it, folks. On December 9th, 2019, Daszak admitted point blank that they were manipulating coronaviruses in the lab. He also specifically mentions that they were not always working with the already known pandemic viruses, but other viruses. On the next episode, we will get into the actual science behind the claims Daszak makes when it comes to coronaviruses, in particular exploring the genome sequencing of 4991 RAT-G13 that Xi Jinping and Daszak claimed occurred after the discovery of COVID-19, when it actually happened well before then. We will also look into the case of 3 dead miners in Yunnan province in China in 2013 that holds crucial clues to the origins of COVID-19. I hate to leave it here, but I don't want to swamp you with information overload, and I nearly worked myself into a catatonic state trying to consolidate everything down into one video that ended up being nearly 3 hours long before I realized there's just too much to cover in one sitting. In future episodes, we will also be looking into the memorandums of understanding that Bill Gates signed with the China National Biotech Group in 2010, the Belt and Road Initiative's influence on the Western world, and the life and lives of the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus. We will also be getting into the COVID vaccine development cycle, Dr. Fauci's patent history, and so much more. If you would like to support my work, you can do so by sending a donation to my Venmo or Cash App. The username is L is for the way on both. A literal dollar makes all the difference, and it means the world that I'm able to do this for you guys. You can also subscribe to my Subscribestar for $5 a month, which you can do so at the link below, www.subscribestar.com/somebitchiknow. Thank you so much for your support. Talk soon. L.